I just finished a brief conversation with a couple of colleagues of mine, graduate students at the California Institute of Integral Studies in the Philosophy and Religion department that I teach in. John Patier and Ashton Arnoldy and I talked about the Peterson Zizek event, about how it wasn't really a debate at all, it was more of a dialogue, and we talked about Jungian psychology. We talked about the need for some sort of new cultural mythos or matrix within which the individual might discover what freedom even is. Because in our contemporary consumer culture, it seems like we're so um, uprooted from any deeper sense of meaning that the freedom that we do have is almost rather cheap and alienating. Um, we have 15 different kinds of cereal to choose from, and yet that kind of freedom almost makes us feel a deepening sense of meaninglessness because of how shallow it is. So, in any event, we covered a lot of territory and tried to shift the conversation in light of the surprise, of the novelty of the Peterson Zizek event. I think people expected a debate between Marxism and capitalism, and what we really got out of that, I think, is the possibility of a new kind of um, dialectic, a new kind of dialogue. And so we tried to carry that forward. And I look forward to hearing your thoughts about it.
So, uh, Jean, you emailed me after my video in Florence, and you were surprised that I was framing things as though Zizek um, schooled Peterson on Marxism, and you thought that there was a different takeaway from their exchange. Do you want to maybe respond a bit to what you thought I was missing?
Yeah. I mean, in your later videos, I definitely saw that you um, got more into details around the criticism. But no, I was mainly just pointing to something which I was actually seeing more in like the comments, which was just a general division. And for me, the problem was resided actually in the debate format. And, everybody like in the audience, they're cheering like it's a boxing match or something, like like it's supposed to be entertaining. And so like the very basic structure of the actual discussion felt to me like there was something that was supposed to be entertaining, intense, fun. And I guess there's some function to that to make it more accessible for people, to have um, like a sort of competition. But to me, that takes away actually from the substance and value of and the seriousness of the discussion. And it was a discussion, and it's not like we're in the Cold War setting where there's U.S. and Russia and or Soviet Union, and that opposition is, for me, is kind of maybe not done with, but we should be striving towards something beyond that dualism. And and for me, that discussion, Zizek actually and Peterson were both, and Zizek probably more, actually making efforts towards not having that opposition. And for me, that was very clear. And just how like the first part, Peterson spoke for 30 minutes, and then Zizek also spoke for 30 minutes. And Peterson just started out by making 10 points that about the Communist Manifesto that he thought was wrong. So he went he kind of played that game, the debate game. And Zizek didn't really do that. He just kind of started speaking. I mean, he had notes, obviously, but it wasn't like he didn't just start defending socialism or bashing capitalism. He got into the details of it and the complexity. And for me, that's the direction of that the political discussion should be going towards.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's my point.
I think that sort of framing of the whole event is important, that it was a dialogue and it wasn't a debate. you know, Zizek is definitely someone who writes and thinks in a dialectical way, which is so much about opposition as it is about seeking a higher synthesis, right, of opposites. And I think that maybe caught Peterson off guard. I don't know who framed the debate as Marxism versus capitalism.
Yeah, that's the thing, right?
I don't know if it was Peterson or Zizek or someone else who was helping to promote the event who knew that that's how you're going to get an audience interested, as if it were like a wrestling match or something. But you know, I know Ashton, you've encountered Zizek before and read some of his essays in college, right? And what is your sense of what Zizek brings to the table as a thinker who's not necessarily a Marxist, but as a critic of culture? Do you value his perspective?
Claim to know his work very well. I've only read one of his works during my undergrad, and it was a class on existentialism in film. And so just from my limited exposure to that, and also just his performance, his person, I think my experience of him is just as being in this situation kind of more surprisingly relational than I before understood him to be, but as a kind of trickster, kind of pulling up the skirt or the tablecloth, and speaking to things that people like plumbing in different parts of the world don't normally pay attention to, but that reveal parts of our systems that aren't apparent. So that's as much as I can really say.
Yeah, so they're both, Peterson and Zizek, are critics of cultural ideology, but Zizek tends to be more critical of sort of the consumer culture, macro level operation of culture, whereas Peterson is much more focused on individual psychology. But it's not that Zizek ignores individual psychology. I mean, he's studied Jacques Lacan's psychoanalytic theory quite deeply.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah, so you've got like Peterson the Jungian and Zizek the Lacanian, and they're both coming out of the Freudian tradition, but they go in very different directions. I think, Zizek's pessimism is in some sense coming from Lacan, where psychoanalysis, there's no healing in Lacan's view, as I understand it. It's sort of like you just come to terms with the fact that you will forever be alienated from your own body and from society, and the best we can do is like learn to play the social game and what Lacan calls the symbolic order, to kind of come to terms with it. But coming to terms with it doesn't mean like individuation or feeling at home again in the natural world or any of that. I think Lacan thinks that that's just a romantic fairy tale. Whereas Jung thought that we really need to find a way to unify or re-engage with and even reintegrate with the natural world and with the deep unconscious psyche. And Jung seemed to think that this might actually be possible for us to do. And so that's, the Jungian background informing Peterson, but it's not clear that Peterson really thinks. They're both very pessimistic. And so I think there's more in Jung than Peterson lets on that can give us hope beyond just, being individuals with clean rooms. I think Jung was pointing to something larger than that. But, you know, I think to start with what they agreed on in this debate, it was that happiness is not the purpose of human life. Maybe it's a side effect. And they're both very pessimistic about our situation as human beings right now. Peterson was defending capitalism as better than Marxism, but also was very critical of it and didn't think that we can solve the problems we're facing, whether social or ecological, within the capitalist framework. Peterson admits that just as much as Zizek does. So for me, the takeaway was, wow, okay, now we can start having a different conversation about what's possible for us beyond 20th century communism, the way that Marxism manifested, and beyond 21st century capitalism as it's currently understood. And, you know, these are such big abstractions, communism and capitalism. We often, I think, get stuck in a tribal warfare and defending one or the other instead of talking about what kind of society and what kind of economy we would like to live within, and just putting the big abstractions away for a second. And I would hope that we can start having that conversation, which to me is far more interesting. And it's maybe too early to tell, but I wonder, what you guys feel about maybe what's wrong with the current setup, economically and socially, whether that's identity politics that are shaping the political scene, or inequality that's shaping the economic scene. Like, what are the major issues right now, and how do you think that this debate helps us reframe them? Either of you have anything that you might want to throw in?
I mean, just a quick idea. I mean, I think a huge aspect actually to the question you just posed is economics, and that's something it takes, you know, like years of training and to acquire competence to actually speak about the economics of that question. And to be honest, I don't have that knowledge. But in terms of, you know, the more, I guess, the philosophical parameters of that question, or the political aspect of it, I would see, living in France, I definitely notice that in the US. And I don't know if your question was you wanted to frame it more in terms of the US, or more like of a modern question, like the modern world.
Well, if you have different answers for different levels, I'd love to hear what you think the situation is in the US versus France, and then maybe globally. I mean, that would be interesting to get your perspective at those different levels.
I mean, there's definitely similarities, but in France, I guess there's more of tradition or history of clashing ideas. And I'm not saying that's not the case in the US, but so at least that's what it seems to me. Like in France, people, it's like it's an actual activity to go protest or riot in the streets, and communities build around that dynamic of us versus them, you know, like populism, I guess you could say, and where you have this group and an elite, and this group goes in the street and fights the elite symbolically. And I mean, now, like the yellow vest, it's like, I don't know, it's 23rd or 24th Saturday in a row where they go out in the street and just fight the police. Every time it's the same thing. And I think that sort of direct exposure to ideas that I've seen in France, like, is something that I see less of in the US, and it kind of results in a mingling of ideas in a more intense way, and that sort of takes away from the sort of intense atmosphere of like political correctness, for instance, that we see in the US, and polarization is very strong in the U.S. because I feel like there's not that much of as much of a contrast or exposure between groups, and I think it's also geographical. Like the city versus people who live kind of more in rural areas, and whereas in France, I don't know, there's just more of a general. The population kind of speaks with different parts of the population, and that creates that sort of brings out the tension in a direct way, but it doesn't have that dimension that you have in the U.S. where it's kind of like a silent tension, and like something is building up, and it never quite goes out at the surface and explodes. And I think that's kind of worrying because it can take some very violent forms, and but in France it's just kind of like this ongoing thing. I guess that's where I'm getting at.
Mm-hmm.
That difference that you just described, I feel it, and maybe you felt it, maybe you feel it now being in Texas, but just feels pretty omnipresent, like this kind of quiet, there's something like right below the surface and everybody's a bit on edge waiting for something to blow up. That feeling versus what sounds like is happening in France. There's a constant bringing it up. But I think in relation to the question Matt posed, and like in relation to what you just shared, I think there, like the issues around identity politics and economics, and like bringing Jung back into the picture, something that I think is overemphasized about his thinking, and also the way happiness is construed, at least in the United States, around the individual and a certain kind of freedom, or conception of freedom as the freedom to do this or that. I think there's something about an imbalance or not enough dialogue, kind of like you were speaking to in France, the tension of relating the needs of the individuals to the larger governing body, or the tension between individuation and the collective, and how they're not antithetical to each other, and that maybe a deeper form of freedom has a collective function. So I just think about, I didn't watch the debate, and I'm not really versed on Peterson, but just from what I did read about it, that when they were discussing happiness and how the economic situation and capitalist situation sets people up to destroy themselves, it just made me think that one of the primary issue animating the economic situation and identity politics is there's like not a conversation between, or not a recognition that there could be possible a form of individual freedom that is at the same time in service of the collective, the collective function, which reminds me of Jung, because as I understand him, his thought, individuation was always along with the collective function. But I'll just stop there. I don't know if that.
Well, I mean, that's the thing about Jung that I I don't see so much coming through in Peterson's interpretation is that, you know, Jung would talk a lot about the collective unconscious and how the ego, which is the part of us that makes us feel like separate individuals, is itself an archetype of the collective unconscious, and it's the one that in our culture we identify most with. But Jung really kind of relativizes the importance and the centrality of the ego, and he talks more about the self. And, you know, maybe Peterson, I haven't seen him go into detail about the anatomy of the psyche from Jung's perspective, but maybe Peterson's talking more about the self than he is about the ego. But if he's defending capitalism, the capitalist social order, as the best way to nurture the self, I think that can't be right. That, you know, maybe it nurtures the ego, and in the sense that you're talking about, Ashton, like happiness within the capitalist social order is, you know, rooted in having your egoic desires met, and often those desires are constructed for us by the advertising industry. And you know, it's not, there's some ambiguity for me around what Peterson is really affirming as what needs to be individuated. Like, is he talking about the ego, or is he talking about the self? Because the self doesn't seem to be at all fostered by a capitalist social order. I'm not saying that communism did better, but that if we really want to value individuals at that higher level that Jung is talking about, where the individual recognizes their embeddedness and their inheritance from a collective unconscious, and their embeddedness within that collective psyche, then we need to think about a different social order that would be capable of fostering that.
I think you make a good point. However, I mean, from what I understand of Peterson, I don't think he actually defends fundamentally capitalism. I think what he defends is freedom, and he sees freedom as being one of the driving forces of capitalism, and sort of what makes it possible, like a free market, for instance. But he's not. That's why I mean, I don't know if he actually defends capitalism, because, you know, there's the whole economics behind it, and what he's really defending is more the sort of ideal of individual freedom, which can be protected under capitalism, and he often also speaks of, like there's the individual, and then the family, and then your community, and then like the wider ranges of how you can impact the world. But his starting point is the individual, and I think that's what he really wants to emphasize, and I think that's why his message has had such an impact, is because it's very empowering to hear that you as an individual, you can that's the starting point, that's your environment, and then maybe your family or your relationships and the community and so on. Whereas and I thought that was interesting, because Zizek was also he wasn't defending like just a collective approach to problems, like having a top-down state regulations. He also appealed to this sort of individualism, but he also then brought in the shadow side of that, where I think he said something like, it's also, he mentioned something about the danger of actually falling in love with your own suffering, and sort of thinking that makes you authentic, and then having a story around that, and also the danger of the story, and that I thought that was very important to bring that about. Danger of myth, and myth is not always this this story that brings us towards the good, the true, and the beautiful. It can also be the Jew myth of Hitler, which Zizek used, and I think it's very important to navigate through these subtle aspects of psychoanalysis, such that Jung explored, and it goes hand in hand with what Peterson explains. But and I'm sure Peterson is aware also of that dimension, you know, the shadow side, and he often speaks of hell, you know, like the symbolic idea of hell, and how there's evil in the world, and all that. And I think it's a way to always keep an eye on. I mean, I think for me, it's a testimony to the fact that, you know, Peterson nonetheless has it includes in his way of thinking this possibility for malevolence, or you could say the shadow aspect, and so basically the debate for me opened up the complexity of that goes beyond Marxism or capitalism, and it's more between individual versus collective, or the group. So that tension that's there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you know, if we were to just step back and ask, like, who has helped individuals get their life in order and feel better about themselves, Peterson obviously comes out on top. Like Zizek, I think his overall influence on culture is, I think, helping people see through certain ideologies, but also, you know, he's just a critic of culture. Peterson is too, but at least Peterson's offering something. Yeah, Zizek doesn't make you feel good about yourself or about the world. And he kept harping on this, like saying to Peterson, like, I'm more pessimistic, way more pessimistic than you are. And he didn't really use that in a dialectical way to push through to something that maybe we can be hopeful about. He just sort of left us there in the dumpster. And so, you know, on that level, I think Peterson has done a much better job sort of buoying, especially young men, making them feel like they have control over their own destiny on some level. And that if they can, get their own shit together, then maybe, you know, change small things. And, you know, he's a great self-help guru. And it's very obvious that he's helped a lot of people. But on the other hand, Zizek's point in response to Peterson's focus on, like, the clean your room motivational speech is that, you know, the society is such that, you know, the capitalist system produces a certain kind of individual. And, you know, one of the contradictions of capitalism is that it goes through these cycles, and this is Marx's point, where, I mean, clearly a lot of wealth is produced. And, like, if we go back to just after World War II, at least in the United States, there was a tremendous growth of the middle class. It only took, each family would have one person in the labor force, you know, who would make enough money to support the entire family. And there was a balance, more of a balance between the owners and the workers. And then, you know, profits started to fall, and around the 70s or 80s, you had this shift into a new phase of capitalism. And also the sexual revolution happened, and women started to join the workforce. And so now all of a sudden, with wages stagnating, to raise a family, the mom and dad both need to work. And all of a sudden, you know, you have a very different set of social conditions. And for, like, our generation, for the first time since, at least again in the United States, for the first time since the end of World War II, it's like our level of income and our economic status is going to be probably lower than our parents in terms of whether, the extent to which we can expect to own a house and like own a car and all these things that were taken for granted in the 1950s as just what every American got. That's not the case anymore. And so I think there's a lot of sort of anger, and this whole populist revolt that's happening is a result of, the mantra of capitalism of just progress and it's just going to get better and better and better. It's like, well, it hasn't panned out that way, and people are pissed because that's what they were told to expect. And so the situation is one now where it's not even a given that individuals living in a capitalist system will have a room to clean up, because especially in urban areas where the jobs are, and where the action is, those rooms are too expensive. And there's not, wages have fallen to a level that's below what is required for people to be able to live. And so I think Zizek would point to this sort of, collective aspect of the situation and say that capitalism's undermining the conditions that make individuality possible. And so again, it's like a dialectic. Obviously we don't want, I don't think Zizek or Peterson is in favor of like centralized government imposition of authority, even if it was in service to trying to make society better. I think the locus of value centered around individuals and the creativity of individuals, I think that centering the locus of value around the individual in that way, I think is really important. But what are the conditions that make individual freedom possible? That's the real question for me. And in a society that doesn't value like taking care of children, that doesn't value education, that doesn't value making sure everyone has healthcare, and doesn't value nutritious food, like, do we really have the conditions as a society that make it possible for individuals to be free? And I don't think that's the case. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting that you bring up the question of freedom, because I think that's central. And one of the things that Zizek said was, in the past there was a sort of there were structures, political or religious structures, which sort of gave kind of a grid, an existential grid, or a path, or a certain moral values, and that for the individual. And now and that was seen kind of as a burden, but paradoxically, it was a liberating burden. And now the burden is freedom. That's what we have, and that word is also very it's very complicated, because this freedom is under the capitalist framework. So there is indeed a huge amount of freedom that we get in our current society, especially in the U.S. And however, there's many. You could argue that it's a very illusory type of freedom, and you can choose an infinite amount of products, types of sodas or whatever. Like if you go to a grocery store and you can choose your identity, how we dress, and tattoos and piercings and your individual expression, your gender, and all these things where prior to that, you couldn't have gone outside of the general structures. But that type of freedom has now come out as a sort of burden. And I think the difficulty with that is definitely a loss of orientation. And I think it's this loss of orientation that Peterson was able to speak to. And for most people, there are certain basic needs that need to be met, such as having a responsibility, and that's not something now that's put out a lot, and it's a sort of a response to that general celebration of freedom now, you know, Peterson came out and said, well, there's also responsibility, and then out of that is a sort of freedom, like a more subtle and complex type of freedom. And so I think that that aspect is extremely important nowadays, to acknowledge that we need some sort of structure, that there needs to be some sort of a guidance, and that in the past came through tradition and so forth, and some sort of collective scheme that was able to bind together a population, and that, for me, that's the collective aspect that you talked about. Like, some people don't even have rooms, and they don't have a narrative that's given to them that can help live through these things. And I think that's the crisis of modernity, is that we don't have these parameters, but we have capitalism, we have the infinite choices, and pleasure, and a happiness, and all these things, which actually, you know, makes the individual more thirsty and hungrier, and more lost than ever. And that's, for me, that's the main question, is how can we maintain the individual within a structure, within some collective goal, or collective framework that will help alleviate the disorientation.
Yeah, there, like, the relationship between freedom and responsibility, I think, reveals how bound up, like, a true freedom and individuality is with a group. And, you know, the question of responsibility to what and to whom, and just the fact that we are in this situation where there's an overemphasis on a certain kind of individuality, to choose to have, you know, to have all these options, and to not really have any coherence around how to choose, apart from just what one wants, what one thinks one wants. And just, I mean, we're in this situation where there's like a huge transvaluation of values happening because of the ecological crisis and feminist critiques of patriarchy, and you know, just what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman, especially given the way technology has changed how that can play out. And so, yeah, it's like that, holding the tension, like holding the conversation between the individual and like a kind of individuality that isn't like just in service to, but that is it coherent with its context. And like, it at least right now, it's not something, it maybe is never something that is like a final, like there's some kind of final structure that isn't subject to change. So it's almost like that these kind of basic aspects of what it means to be an individual and also a collective that's constantly changing, those aspects seem like they have to be made explicit, and then whatever approach is created going forward has to have that built into it. Mm-hmm. And identity too.
Yeah. Well, I mean, modernity has always been possessed by this Promethean impulse to break free of all restraints. And that manifests technologically, like in the way that you're hinting at, Ashton, that like around gender, like it used to be something that's just determined biologically, but now, you know, not only can we perform different genders from our sex biologically, but we can actually alter ourselves biologically. And that's part of the freedom that we're afforded. And
that, and like just birth control,
and
things
yeah,
like that.
something's, yeah, right. And so there's that Promethean impulse, which is, I think, really destabilizing society to the point where, like in the 70s, when I was describing this shift in the 70s and 80s between a prior form of capitalism and a new phase of capitalism that's sometimes called neoliberalism, like Margaret Thatcher in the UK, the prime minister at the time, said like that society doesn't exist, that it's just individuals competing with one another. And on the one hand, I don't want to downplay the concreteness of individuals in favor of some abstraction like the society, but I think this impulse to just liberate the desires of individuals, that capitalism does a great job at, like liberating desire. I think it's becoming more and more clear that whatever, like human nature doesn't come kind of pre-installed with just a certain set of desires. Our desires are very malleable, and to just unleash desire in the way that capitalism is now, the desires of individuals, it backgrounds the extent to which, again, like the individual is shaped by their society, and our desires are, as Zizek was pointing out, drawing on Lacan, like we think we know what we want, and then we finally get what we thought we wanted, and it's like terrifying because it's not what we wanted at all, we realize. And like it's even more complex than that, because we want what we're expected to want, but then when we actually get it, we realize it's not what we wanted at all. And so this question of just making sure people are free to choose to buy certain products or to dress a certain way, that's not the kind of freedom that I think we really want. And maybe the most important conversation we can be having, like us, people who study philosophy, or just the average citizen, is what is freedom? What kind of freedom do we really value? And in the philosophical tradition, there are these two ways of thinking about freedom: positive freedom and negative freedom. And usually in liberal capitalist societies, negative freedom is what's emphasized. Negative freedom is, not having any authority imposed upon you from the outside. And it's more like this "don't tread on me" attitude. Leave me alone so that I can be free. That's like negative freedom. Whereas positive freedom is more of this communitarian ethic, where freedom means you're free when you're fully participating in shaping your community. You're free when you have responsibility that gives you meaning, because you feel like you're contributing to something larger than yourself. And that's where we find freedom. And that's more like the way that the Greeks thought of freedom. There's plenty of things that made like ancient Athens not a free society, like all the slaves that were taking care of their basic needs. But in terms of how they thought of freedom, freedom is not something private. Freedom is something you realize in public spaces, through debate, through participation in shaping one's society. Whereas they would think of the sort of private freedom that Americans tend to value more, like just leave me alone in my house and don't bother me. They would think of that more as like a form of slavery. And Hannah Arendt points this out in her analysis of how the idea of freedom has evolved over time. So, I think this is a really important question that we should be asking, is what is freedom, rather than assuming we know already, right?
Yeah. I think that's a great point to bring up, and I can't help but see the current situation that we're speaking about kind of as an adolescent phase, and adolescent phase that's given all the tools and the resources to enact out the desires. And I'm thinking also of René Girard, the French philosopher, and he speaks of mimetic desire. this sort of instinctual behavior that we have to imitate. And so, like you said, we can desire something just out of mere imitation, but not because it's a fundamental need. And that's capitalism has definitely found that that sort of weakness, actually, and been able to work it out and have the individual follow trends and fashions that are completely useless and unnecessary and alienating in a lot of ways and dangerous. And on top of that, we have the technological development to alter things in a way that's going to be unpredictable, and who knows where that's going to go, how much we can actually alter our bodies and bend the biological parameters for our own desires and our own dispositions. And I think that's dangerous, and that's definitely something that's definitely something important to consider is, like you said, positive versus negative freedom, and how much freedom is enough to realize that it's not going to fulfill our basic human needs, or at least only at a surface level, or at some material level. Of course, like we have to acknowledge, that it's good to be able to walk wherever you want, and it's amazing that we've arrived at such a level of freedom. But yet, like you talked about, there's still something we're hungry for, and that's a lot of the individual responsibility aspect. But still, there's another side to that coin, and it's, how do we maintain a structure that allows individuals to be able to carry on their own individual responsibility? It's difficult to also have a society that can encourage and allow the individual to cultivate that, because there are sharks lurking around, and there's we have basic human behaviors like imitation and the desires like childish desires, which we can kind of get possessed by, I think, and I think, yeah, that's the difficulty, is to be able to have both the individual responsibility and some sort of collective structure that allows for that responsibility that allows for the individual to flourish in a community.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I just wanted to say I recently read Percy Shelley's Defense of Poetry, where he talks a lot about imitation and like poetry as like a way of attuning to the rhythm of the world, and it's like a form of creative imitation, but once it becomes abstract, then it's dead and it's devoid of the spirit. And so I just think about it in relation to what you were describing about how technology has enabled humans to depart from the biological trajectory in a way that has unforeseen consequences. And like the question, what should guide or instruct the way that we innovate and use technology, and likewise, like what should be the measure for how we organize our societies and how individuals are reared up in those. Like what's the measure? And it's the same question, I think. What are we responsible to? Who are we?
Mm-hmm.
Just wanted to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Peterson really seems to, and Zizek actually, they were both emphasizing the biblical tradition as a source of kind of mythic or archetypal orientation. Peterson seemed surprised by Zizek's like hearkening back to like a form of Christian salvation almost, though a weird kind of salvation where the idea is that even Jesus was an atheist, and they both at the very end started to have an interesting conversation about that, the role of spirituality, specifically Christian spirituality, in providing a new form of like mythic grounding for human beings. And I don't think it necessarily needs to be the Christian tradition, but I mean, Jung certainly felt like we need to, like, people who are living in Europe and North America have inherited a certain sort of stream of the collective unconscious that ties them back to that biblical tradition, and for them to try to turn to the East or something for a source of salvation or enlightenment is going to like scramble the psyche in a way that Jung was uncomfortable with. He thought we needed to go back to our own roots. I don't know if that's necessarily the case, and things have certainly developed a lot in even the last 50 years in terms of the emergence of something more like a planetary culture. But it remains an open question, I think, the extent to which we can rediscover a sense of cultural limitation that provides like a matrix that we feel responsible to uphold, because the way that the technological trajectory is headed is that like there are no limits, and each individual, at what point are we just going to be able to plug into our own little VR headset and like have the equivalent of a lucid dream where we get to do whatever we want and inhabit whatever world we want, and all the sensory inputs are such that there's a seamlessness so that we feel like we're really there. And like, I don't know technologically how far we are from that place, but as soon as that, it seems feasible that technology would be created, and given the social situation right now, we're just going to lose people. They're just going to beam themselves into those virtual worlds, and people are going to be willing to spend the majority of their lives plugged in, because I think we're already seeing, even with like smartphones and stuff, the extent to which people would much rather be in a virtual world than to live in this actual world where they're in control of all the parameters. And it seems like that's the direction that this Promethean impulse is taking us. And unless we have some sort of new cultural mythos to put the brakes on to give us a different sense of collective value, then like individuals are just going to spin off into their own little narcissistic worlds, even more so than they already are. So there's like a real sense of urgency here, because it's like that turning point is coming, and at some point there's no turning back. And so the whole human project seems to be at risk, and not just the human project. I mean, obviously we're having an influence, an impact on the rest of the planet too, the non-human world. But things are just accelerating so quickly right now. And, I do actually think that this event that brought Peterson and Zizek onto the stage together is truly novel. It was like unexpected. Didn't play out the way that people expected it to, and it's leading to conversations like this. And so maybe all is not lost. I'm open to surprises, but I'm worried about the trajectory.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, that's my main hope from what happened with that debate, is that it opened up the complexities that around these questions, and I don't know if it's a sort of naive hope that we can go beyond these basic labels of happiness and capitalism and Marxism and all these names, and actually, that dive into the dialectics and the difficulties, and actually pinning down a specific problem or a specific group. And there's the proclivity to simplify these things is very dangerous, and I think it's counterproductive. And that's my hope, is that there can be that this debate kind of gave a sense that, you know, things are not, it's not socialism versus capitalism. It's not just individual versus collective. And these are sort of basic polarities, but they're very connected. They're actually directly connected to each other, and they work together. And there's something out of that which can grow. And yeah, I hope that that this debate can bring that more into the forefront.